Okay, good evening, guys. It's March 8th, 2019. This is the live chat for Management 824, Colorado Tech. It's Dr. Long here. Recording should be available about 20 minutes after we finish up. So let's go ahead and get on with it. Temperature is pretty good back here in Kansas. It's up in the low 40s, so it's almost feeling normal. That's almost like a heat wave lately, so hopefully it's okay where you guys are. So I'm going to follow the standard agenda here. I'm going to emphasize mostly the new material. I'm going to lay out the optional assignment for IP number 5. That's the final project, and I'll have more to say about that. And I'm going to be comparing sort of the rational managerial approach to change and planning to maybe the transformational innovative school of thinking about what it takes to be successful, to show that there are more than one ways to skin a cat when it comes to the kinds of planning that we can do. And I'll try to connect that to the individual project. I'm also going to cover some stuff on Rand Corporation's meta study on planning for uncertainty. I covered a little bit about that last week, but I want to review some of the main ideas there, because I think an appreciation of those insights will help us decide to what extent we want to be rational managers and to what extent we want to be pushing for creative, innovative solutions. And then that may actually help give you some things to think about on future assignments, about the choices that businesses have to try some of these different strategies, like the horizontal or vertical integration, or whether they want to do benchmarking or balanced scorecarding or Lean Six Sigma, whatever it may be. Okay, so as always, if there are any questions or concerns you have, please just go chunk them into the chat window there, and I'll answer them as we go. And if you're listening to the archive, if there's anything you'd like to hear me cover in the future, or something that wasn't clear, or you'd like to hear more about one of these particular topics, please just send me an email, and I'll get it going for future chats. Okay. So just going off the working list of themes from assignments so far, I would say you guys are knocking it out of the park when it comes to implementing the doctoral mind and the doctoral role. It's really kind of unusual to see everybody getting it this early in the course. I mean, there's in the other section I'm teaching, there's still some folks going into Unit 5 that are struggling a little bit with it and need additional coaching. So it's really a pleasant surprise and very enjoyable to see you guys already operating at such a high level. So I would just say keep up the great work. You're not going to have any trouble with the material or the grades or any of that stuff. You really are in a position to really develop some useful skills in this course. So just keep up the great work. Maintain that momentum. So that's all I really kind of want to say about that. So last week, what I described in general was this approach to the optional assignment for IP number 5, in which I suggest and recommend that you consider doing a personal brand and developing a 5-year plan for where you want to be with this degree 5 years after graduation. And so what I suggested was that your end product for IP number 5 would consist of this far right-hand box, where you would produce a 12 to 15 page document that included a business plan, an action plan for how you would implement it, and then an elevator speech that you would use kind of as a 3 to 5 minute focusing executive summary to an investor or to anybody that you would want as a client, that would give them a no-nonsense, top-level reason why they should listen to you, why they should invest in you, why they should listen to your advice. And so the way I recommended doing that was an adaptation of stuff that I'm working on with my clients, as an example, and my military strategic planners, where we take the list of questions in the first box as a way to do an exploratory search on ourselves and our environment and come up with all the raw material of ourselves, our environment, our clients, our potential competitors, try to find out what is motivating us, and then just gathering all of those insights into one big pile of raw material. So the middle box then would represent a set, not all-inclusive, but a set of different mental models or analytical engines or analytical lenses that we could use to begin making sense out of all that raw material we had developed from the first set of questions. So we could do design thinking or systems thinking to begin packaging some of this material. We might do a SWOT analysis and a stakeholder analysis to start looking for different ways we could come up with pieces of the strategic plan that eventually gets refined into those three elements on the right-hand side. We might take something like project management or the Cotter change model to help us develop a feasible implementation approach to go from current state to the future state in a logical, controlled, adaptive way. We might use the principles of continuous improvement to be open to the possibility for learning as we go. We might adopt the mindset and the spiritual orientation of the Noble Eightfold Path or the 10 ox herding pictures or the Kaizen culture of Japanese manufacturing to create a climate of continuous improvement at work, so that we had a top-down strategic plan that's given us a direction and a general approach, and that we've got a culture that's helping us from the bottoms up handle all of the daily transactions with each other and with our clients and with other allies, to get the most value and cause the least harm out of every transaction that leads us towards that success, right? So that's, in a nutshell, a generalized approach about how to start with the end in mind, the business plan, the action plan, the elevator speech, and then develop the systematic pile of raw material, and then methods of processing it and refining that into an actionable plan. To go to the next layer of detail, what that might look like actually in practice, this follows the model that I recommend with my clients, and which I personally applied when I did this back in, I guess about 2008, and which I do periodically whenever I'm thinking of a new line of business for myself or if I'm advising someone on their business. I use this when I'm helping maybe some of my peers navigate the path through retirement from the Army into civilian life. Sometimes they're going to stay on and teach at our college as a civilian. Sometimes they're going to explore new career opportunities. And so I follow this general approach to help them organize their thoughts and resources at a critical time like that. So that's why I feel confident in offering this to you. The folks in the last 5 semesters that have applied this approach to this project have all been very positive about the results and given me good feedback on how to improve it. So what you have here is kind of a tested model of design thinking that helps you get from the current state to a desired future state, that helps you develop the problem statement of the things that are preventing you from just going there immediately, the things that make it a challenge. It talks about different ways you can develop an organizational approach and how to get there, the method for connecting those ends and the means. And then finally, the fifth section I've added on motivation is an area that is not usually found in design thinking, but I found to be helpful, especially when it comes to personal planning or personal reinvention. If you're working on design thinking for strategy with an organization, chances are the motivation is already there, that there's some organizational drivers that really don't call into question why they're doing those things, that there's a reason, the survival of the firm, the desire to make profits, all of those things are kind of already in place. It's not an existential set of questions. But sometimes when you are contemplating a change in your own mission statement or your own business planning, that that these areas of motivation help you with the emotional content of the plan that makes this more than just a rational response to the environment, but activates those personal qualities of persistence and resilience that help us. I would suggest, Christina, that you should at least think about all of them. Now, I've had some folks that did it that included all of these in their work. So I would at least start with this as like if you wanted to take this as an outline, you could start working on it and then find out how much you wanted to write about each one. And you could obviously, cut some of those out. But I would start with these as a pretty good initial outline. And they're not all inclusive. You might find there's other things that you need to add to it. So the way I would generally approach this as an outline is I would say, if you go over onto the right-hand side, it says, the optional assignment is to produce a personal brand and strategic plan. That should answer whatever you decide to write on in 12 to 15 pages, not including the cover page, the references, or the appendices that you might want to add for your own use. Let's say that you pick 12 pages, and if you wrote 2 pages on each one of these questions, that would put you at 12 pages. And so if you went through this design process on the left-hand side, you would end up being able to answer all of these 6 primary questions. And that might, you could pick any way to organize you want, but you'd essentially be accomplishing those purposes, answering all of those crucial questions, like where are you going to be 5 years after graduation in time, space, and concept? Who are you in that future? Who is that better self that you are, and what is it that you do, and who are you helping? What is it that you're doing? How did you get there? What was the method that you chose? How would your brand be described by people that you work for, or that you're helping, or that are observing you, or that are on your team? How would they be describing that brand? And then the final section, why would you succeed, connects to that questions of motivation there, that asks you to generate those resources that will help you get through the tough times. Well, Christina, this is up to you. If you opted to do this, you can answer this any way that you want to. You might pick 5 years after Army retirement. You might pick where you want to be in the Army 5 years from now, maybe supplemented by the things that you're learning from this program. I would suggest whichever one of those makes the most sense to you or seems to add the most value, I would try to link it to the elements of the CTU program so that you could use this as a guide to help you get the most out of every class that you go through. So, I mean, you're spending a lot of time and money and effort on this program. And so I think you ought to demand that it produces as much value for you as possible. And the way to do that is to be an informed customer, to make the program work for you, to make the college work for you, to make the professors work with you to help you achieve your educational outcomes. The way to do that, I think, is to start with the end in mind. Where you want to be 5 years after graduation or 5 years after retirement. What's that future look like in the ideal world? Don't be constrained. And then once you answer all these questions and you go through those steps in the design thinking, then this will allow you to evaluate each lesson or each course as a tool that will help you achieve those realities. Yeah, Edward asked the question, have I seen a connection between design thinking and appreciative inquiry? I will send you a link to my take on appreciative inquiry. One of my professors and my doctoral mentor, Dr. Tojo Thatchenkari, did a variation of that. He was a peer of Dr. Cooper Ryder, and he wrote a book on appreciative sharing of knowledge, which is a special form of appreciative inquiry, and it provides a really useful model of how to achieve breakthrough transformations using the positive psychology elements of appreciative inquiry. So I think there could be a lot of overlap between design thinking and appreciative inquiry. Appreciative inquiry, in my view, takes a special form of the positive psychology movement to perform planning and design thinking in a certain way. It emphasizes certain aspects of our human experience, right? And so it can help you answer all of those questions that are on that page. But it's also possible to do design thinking not through that lens of positive psychology. So there is an overlap between them, and appreciative inquiry supports design thinking. If you do it right, it's a beautiful way to get the most out of the positive elements of your experience. So yeah, the short answer to your question is I do see a strong connection between them, and I will certainly send you guys a link later tonight on my take on appreciative sharing of knowledge. I actually use that as part of one of the initiatives I examined in my dissertation work in trying to generate innovations at my college, and I had a very positive experience with it. So I'll share that with you. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about this slide, was that if we go back one and we say in general we want to start with a lot of raw material that are exploratory, and then pick a set of focusing lenses or models, mental models and processes. We can then produce a business plan, action plan, and an elevator speech. One way that might look like in practice is this one, where I've actually gone through and picked design thinking and then certain elements to answer, certain models to apply, and then how that would map to a 12 to 15 page approach. You could use this as a start point, or you could do your own work on that too if you want. Yeah, it's really it's your choice on how to proceed, because it's your life and it's your project. And the reason to do this not only is to help you with the program, but it also gives you an exposure to what it's like applying these tools to an individual's situation, so that if you found yourself, in 5 years from now as a teacher or a consultant or in charge of an HR department or trying to do faculty development or executive development, and you were using this kind of design thinking with clients or subordinates or students, you could have some empathy for what it's like to go through that, and you could use this as an example of how to do it. That shared experience would help you be a better guide to people that you were advising. So not only will it give you a way to tie together all of the elements that you're going to learn in this course, but it also has a practical value in life as a consultant or a teacher or as a leader. And it also, I think, will help you organize your relationship with Colorado Tech to make sure that the lessons and courses are giving you the best return on your investment, that you can leverage those courses to help you achieve your long-term plan. That way you can be responsible for your own educational outcomes, okay? So that's everything I propose to say on that, pending any questions, okay? All right, so the next piece up is this slide. And this is an extract of a RAND Corporation meta-study on lessons that they had learned from many programs they'd done for national security planning. So over the last 30 or 40 years, they've been a really useful think tank for Department of Defense, executive branch, Congress, private consultants or clients. And so they've done many dozens of strategies for planning under uncertainty. And so what they did was they went through all their literature and the existing academic literature too, and came up with some insights that seemed to be appropriate for anybody that was involved in planning under uncertainty. So I thought I would share these ideas with you as practical tips to think about when you're doing IP5, but also when you're doing the different IPs and the DBs in our course. Okay, so there's a lot of good thoughts in here. So I'm just going to go through the list. So the first insight is that uncertainty analysis requires two kinds of thinking. Initially, some creative divergent work to make sure that you get a very wide range of possibilities to consider, that you're looking at the whole problem and solution space, that you're not locked into your first idea. But then, typically, there comes a time when you have to shift over to the analytical convergent work that will enable you to give specific recommendations to a decision maker. So we have to combine both divergent and convergent thinking. That we have to combine creative, innovative thinking with analytical, critical thinking. So both kinds of work has to be done to get to a complete product. Next, there is a need for both theory and data-driven approaches. So it's not one or the other. We've got to blend the practical with the academic, the theoretical with the experiential, if we want to get a full accounting for the environment and the problem and the solution. So in many ways, that almost argues for a mixed method approach by default. By the same token, we need to see experimentation and iteration in order to reduce uncertainty and increase discovery. So experimentation means that we got to test the theoretical insights. Iteration means we've got to do multiple loops so that as we learn from each controlled experiment, each manageable experiment, each manageable cycle, that we can learn some lessons and then feed that forward and then continue to make progress in manageable bite-sized steps. That this argues for an action research, action learning kind of approach to innovation and planning. Next, we can therefore expect strategy to be revisited often and then modified over time, as opposed to what is often a common assumption by your clients, which will be, hey, all we got to do is get the strategic plan right once, that we just figure out what needs to be done, come up with the master plan, and then it's set in stone for all time and space. We don't have to keep coming back, that we can answer those questions once and for all. Well, in truth, we should expect and plan for that strategy to be revisited and modified. So we need to have means to do so. We've got a budget for it. We've got to build in some decision points and some sensors to gather information to tell us when is it time to, re-engineer or to restudy, or at least to reset. Next, it's good practice to make the policymaker or the decision maker aware of our key assumptions, to have them acknowledge the assumptions and their limits, and then and only then present the results, so that we don't get blinded by the results and then forget that they're based on certain assumptions. And if the assumptions change, that the results are going to change. So having that acknowledgement explicitly up front prevents us from going off the deep end. It allows us to come back and iterate. They observe that policymakers are open to uncertainty analysis if it helps them reach decisions. So one of the things that we've got to do up front is, when we are proposing the method for planning that we're going to take them through, that the policymakers need to see how that approach is going to help them make decisions. And many times they're not willing to take that on faith. And maybe they shouldn't. Maybe we should have to justify our choice of approach. And remember that the bottom line is that going through these planning approaches, whatever they may be, should help us make better decisions sooner and at lower cost with risk management. Right? So we should be able to lay that out ahead of time. Next. Be aware that any initiative that you're conducting to plan for uncertainty, there's going to be some people in the organization, usually the traditionalists or the conservatives, who are going to look at that, the start of the planning, as a threat to the status quo and whatever advantage it represents to them. There's going to be some people who resist change because all they can see are the threats. They don't see the opportunities. Maybe they don't see the risk of not planning, that if they don't do any plan, that the status quo is going to mathematically fail at some point. So they may not see that. But you have to recognize that there's going to be people in the organization that fall into that category, and your strategic communication plan should account for that and somehow try to include them in the dialogue, because they can offer some certain insights. You can't let them bog you down, but you've got to at least acknowledge that they're going to be there. Next. Theories of planning under uncertainty and preparing to cope with surprise effectively is difficult and complex. Acknowledge that's hard to do. But the implementation and then maintaining those changes are even harder than the planning. So a lot of times we think like we've completed the plan and we've done all the hard work. The heavy lifting is over. No. It's just started. A funny line that I've heard on that is that planning is 90% of the work, and then execution is the other 90%. It's really probably 10 and 90. That all you need really is a good enough plan to get going, and adaptation, preparation, and execution, and then learning from it is really where the hard work gets done. So it's important to do planning properly and thoroughly and professionally, but we can't delude ourselves into thinking that once we've done that, then we've done all the work, that there's a lot more still waiting for us ahead, right? Next, under recommendations, they said, look, policymakers should demand that the analysis that you're giving them aids them in finding FAR strategies. FAR meaning flexible, adaptive, and robust. So it may be that the clients that are workloading you aren't asking for flexible, adaptive, and robust. Maybe they're asking for just simple things because that's all they think that's needed. You should educate them on what's really needed if their opinion is wrong. You should be doing that kind of due diligence to help them become a better consumer of your skills. And so that may mean that you have to raise the bar with them so that they are asking for something that's more difficult, because in the long run it's good for them. Maybe harder work for you, but it's in the long run usually what's required. Okay. Next. The appropriate standard for analysis should include being sure that if you omit considerations because of uncertainty, that doesn't jeopardize the study's conclusion. So this has to do with sensitivity analysis and how to manage the human desire to reduce complexity to where it's understandable and it feels like we're in control. So there's many ways. There's this illusion of control out there that if we just simplify it down to a couple important things, then we'll be okay. Put all your eggs in one basket and then watch that basket. But if we make simplifying assumptions, it should come with a risk assessment that says, here's the additional risk we're taking by implementing the simplifying assumption. And it may be a risk worth taking. It may allow us the ability to act in time, but we shouldn't kid ourselves to think that just by simplifying we can reduce the risk and make it easier than it is. Things are as hard as they are, and simplifying assumptions is a choice that we make, and it should be justified. When we're doing scenario analysis for portfolios, that we want to make sure that each strategy that we're testing has to be able to perform in all of the scenarios. So you got to test each strategy against all the scenarios and against all the measures of effectiveness in order to truly be systematic and disciplined. You can't just cherry pick. And the same token, when we are testing things analytically, that we need to find a set of stress tests that actually challenge us with dangerous implications, that you can't just cherry pick the things that are easily addressed and prove that your plan works. You need insurance for your worst day on the planet. You need a business plan for your worst day in the business, not the best day. It should protect you against those kinds of unforeseen risks or those the intersection of many bad things all happening at once. So that's what we mean by a stress test, to give it an actual genuine shakeout to see if the plan will hold up. So don't neglect that part. Planning should provide general capabilities and organizational agility to allow adaptation to unanticipated developments. So what do we mean by that? It's sort of like the difference between training and education. So if you know what to do, you train for it. And then when that set of conditions comes up, you have this rehearsed technique and you can just do it. Education is what you do when you're not sure what the future will hold or what sequence the future is going to come to. So our plans must allow us to build that kind of generic adaptive capability so that we have resources and skills to respond to the things we didn't anticipate or we didn't have a contingency plan for. This is not to say that we shouldn't do contingency planning. We should for those high probability or high payoff events. But we should also not kid ourselves in thinking that we can plan for every possible contingency, that we have to have a set of principles that can guide us on what to do. We have to invest in the capacity to sense and respond. We've got to try to get our early warning devices out there so that we have enough time to respond, and then trust in our ability to figure it out in the moment. We can actually practice doing that by not always going with scripted scenarios, but actually trying to challenge ourselves to be creative and critical and to look at things under time constraints and start developing some of those skills. Next. Or finally, the next bullet about major surprises is kind of a restatement of that same thing. Narrowing the analysis of the study at hand should not be based on conventional wisdom or the desire to avoid controversy. So that sort of argues against political correctness and sociability or being liked. That when we're designing our stress tests and doing contingency planning, We ought to be looking at the demands of the environment and the demands of the organization to be prepared. And if that ruffles some feathers or leads us into areas of uncomfortable truth, well then so be it. That's more important to be prepared than it is to be buddy-buddy with everybody or to be politically correct. So that's that insight. So this is a collection then of Rand's best work over many decades about planning with uncertainty in strategic level, high risk areas. And I think they offer a lot of good insights to any kind of strategic or business planning that we might do. They're good ideas to stay mindful of as a sort of like a checklist on how to do this correctly. So assuming no other questions, I'm going to drive on. So the next thing I want to cover is to compare and contrast two mental models of planning and management. Both of them have been very successful and are still being used today. And each one, you can make an argument, is appropriate for certain kinds of problems and certain kinds of choices that we make about how to solve those problems. So on the left-hand side, you see a listing of the elements of the new Rational Manager, originally published in 1958 by Kepner-Trigo, a consulting organization that has a great reputation, is still active today, and has a lot of clients, hundreds and thousands of clients worldwide, and have had a track record of great success. They updated their little manual and insights in 65, 85, 92, and lately. And they take the approach of rational management, and their book describes the following major chunks of their approach. So I'm just going to summarize that and suggest that it's a reasonable way to approach planning for change and planning for operational excellence. So they start off with the premises under which rational management ought to work. They point out things like that the organization is one of mankind's most powerful inventions that allowed us to go from families and tribes of hunter-gatherers into organized collections of teams and groups that could achieve collaborative effects and create civilization. You don't have to be friends with everybody, but we have to be able to find ways to organize our work so that we can take advantage of experts and we can cover each other's weak spots with our strengths. So rational management holds out the promise that we can plan for that and we can design systems that can do that. Now, there are about 5 areas or 6 areas in which that rational management that they describe manifests, or 6 domains. I'll cover them briefly. First, problem analysis of how to distinguish between cause and effect, between problems which they describe as the effects produced by some deep cause, that you have some deep level problem that is causing these effects, that we see the effects and we have to reason back to the original root cause, and that's our problem, is to do that. We can do that by describing the problem carefully, by specifying its elements with details. We can find rules for cause and effect. We can look at the boundaries and so forth. So problem analysis is the first step in rational management. The next one is decision analysis, that we can subject our process for making decisions to some rules and do that well and do it with quality control and checklists and explicit processes. So decision analysis looks a lot like what we would call rational utility theory, where we can define the measures of performance, establish a scale on which to measure, collect data to inform how well each course of action is performing or could perform, and then make a decision based on the highest expected payoff. So decision analysis looks at the process we use to come to decisions. The next one is potential problem or opportunity analysis. This one says, at any given time, you can do an environmental scan and figure out that there's things that we could fix or opportunities that we could seize, And so let's do an environmental scan to identify those and then choose which ones to actually perform in order to get the best return on the use of our limited resources. So evaluating potential problems or opportunities is a rational, systematic approach. Situational appraisal is what you do when you go to work and you look around to see what's going on now with all of the projects and all of the programs and the problems and opportunities we're trying to solve and the decisions we got to make. What is our posture right now? How do we do that kind of environmental scanning to see how well we're doing? And are we still on track to achieve our goals? Is our plan still working? Or do we need to make adjustment decisions? That's what we mean by situational appraisal, the integration of all the ongoing initiatives. Well, people are going to do all that work. So the next area of rational management has to do with managing human performance. And that's how to do that in a policy-based, rule-based, systematic way that is fair and balanced for all of our people, and that we're being consistent and open about how we do things. So we can do that in a rational way and not just playing favorites. And then finally, in 1958, it was considered kind of groundbreaking to examine how to install a rational management system or culture in an organization, because, 1958, not everybody was doing that. It was still, organizations were as they had grown up to have been. In many cases, they were the result of a family or some crazy genius who organized a company that in a way that made sense to him. Well, when you convert to professional rational management, that can represent a transitional form or a transformational process to shift the culture. So how to do that in a rational way? This line of thinking eventually leads us to the Cotter change model, developed to study exactly how to do that in a systematic way. So the left-hand side then under Kepner-Trigo would be how a rational, common sense, Western-oriented managerial class would look at how to think in a systematic way about the science and craft of management. That's not the only way to go about it. If you just do that, maybe you're neglecting the art, or you're missing the opportunities for bold transformations. That maybe that lends itself to incremental improvements. So an alternative approach is described by the MIT Sloan Innovation Radar research published in 2006, and I'm going to show you that article here in a minute. And both that article and these slides are all uploaded in Unit 3 for you to review later, and you may find that to be very interesting. So MIT Sloan School of Management talks about innovation as being something different than just R&D or just continuous improvement. It really is a systematic, disciplined approach to find transformational change opportunities in time to make a big difference in our bottom line, to seize the day, to seize the opportunity, to be a market leader. And it's more than just R&D. It says you have to be unique and add big value to really be innovative, to be able to survive. And that you can do this in a systematic way. It's not haphazard, it's not random. They suggest that you can be systematic by using what they call the radar of innovation, which identifies 12 different dimensions in which transformation or innovation can be developed or discovered. And then their recommendation is, after doing that kind of research with a lot of clients for over 10 years, is that they would recommend focusing on a couple of the areas where there's low-hanging fruit and really try to exploit that for a rapid payoff, and then develop the other dimensions of the model as time permits and opportunities arise. Right? So this whole innovative approach suggests that it's worth swinging for the fences, to look for the big breakthroughs, that's the way that you actually create great value in the marketplace. So I want to just share with you a little bit of that article. There it it is. Let me call that up, sorry. So again, this is in number 3, unit 3 for you. So this is from 2006, MIT Sloan School of Management, 12 different ways for companies to innovate. This framework, the innovation radar, ensures that companies don't miss those opportunities. So I'm not going to read the whole article to you. I'm going to leave it for you to discover, but just some things I want to highlight about it. The opening sections, they just quote some CEOs who said, hey, modern business demands innovation, that business as usual just won't cut it. You cannot just benchmark or do best practices, because then all you ever end up doing is what everybody else is already doing, that you don't stand out from the crowd, and that way leads to disaster. To really add value, they say you got to get beyond what your peers are doing. They say, for example, if you're not innovating in technology, you're going to do what everybody else does, which is focus on product R&D. Chemical, oil, and gas industries that use commodities tend to emphasize process innovations, and so how to be more efficient in their production. So that doesn't distinguish you from your peers. Consumer packaged goods look at things like branding and distribution improvements. But if all firms in an industry, they say, are seeking opportunities in the same places, they're going to come up with the same innovations. So they say what has to be done for business innovation is to dramatically broaden your scope, much more than just product or technological innovation. You got to look at some dramatic breakthrough thinking, like Starbucks convinced people that they represented a third way. They created an ambiance and convinced people to spend $4 for a cup of coffee. Dell changed the concept and idea of computer manufacturing and R&D. Google, who created a thing called paid search and created value where there wasn't. So they move on to discuss and define business innovation as the creation of substantial new value for customers and the firm by changing one or more of the dimensions of the business systems. This is a dramatic transformational change, and it has 3 important characteristics. It's about value and not just things. The section on their research tells how they went about developing those elements. It says innovation can come in many flavors, for example, the 12 different dimensions of this radar screen, and that business innovation is or can be systematic, and that you can make sure that you look at everything so you don't have blind spots, that it's not random or haphazard. You can be systematic. So each one of these areas, offerings, platforms, solutions, etc., going around the horn, they then will go through and describe different ways in which that dimension supports innovation. They summarize a lot of different examples of each one of those dimensions here. I'll leave that for you to read and consider. And then they conclude the article with some advice that says things like, when you put this to work, that the best way to do it is kind of like applying the Pareto principle, where 20% of the big ideas account for 80% of the value. So 20% of 12 dimensions is like 2.5. So they would recommend, and they say that here, that if you pick 2 or 3 areas where you think that you could innovate quicker than others, that it'd be better to try that right away and really try to exploit that as much as possible, rather than using a shotgun approach or dabbling a little bit everywhere. It's better to focus and really go for it in those areas. They offered some insights that they have an instrument, for example, those particular researchers have an instrument that would allow you to do an organizational inventory like this one shows. Let me see. Sorry for jumping around so much. Yeah, so this one shows like 5 or 4 different banks that did that organizational survey for innovation to try to find areas that they could really leverage early to get a big exploitation. Like this one in the brown, bank number 2, really scored high on the branding innovation. So they ought to really try to do that well, whereas they had a very low rating, near 1, on the processes or how to do things. So they should really be focusing more on the brand or on their customers as the potentially highest payoff in the shortest amount of time. It's already an area of expertise. But systematically, to go around the horn eventually and try to incorporate all of these at some point in the future. So that's what they talk about in this article, about putting the innovation to work and how to approach this by focusing on a few high impact dimensions rather than attempting the shotgun approach. So I say all that simply to say that we now have, there's 2 different ways that we might think about approaching this strategic planning and visioning and process improvement. The Kepner-Trigo rational manager approach, which to me looks more like an iterative, systematic approach, maybe appropriate for a mature industry where we have a really good awareness of what's possible in our domain. Or the MIT Sloan category, maybe for emerging markets or new areas of business or trying to create that transformational breakthrough, that we could adopt either one or maybe even a combination of those approaches as we're thinking about how to produce our business plan. So if you tied that back to the Unit 5 IP, that would suggest that you could think about where you want to be 5 years after graduation, either as a transformational experience or as a logical extension of where you already are. So Christine, that might work for you on the Kepner-Trigo model because you're still going to have some Army commitment, and so maybe you have to operate inside that frame of reference. So maybe that's not transformational as best. Maybe you need that rational approach. But if you were looking at life after the, 5 years after Army retirement, you could maybe do the innovative approach to come up with a more dramatic reinvention of your life in retirement. So that's really a choice that you get to make on something that makes sense for you in your context. And that's really the essence of strategic planning that I wanted to make the final point this week. And that is that context matters, and that how you apply this to the situation really does matter. And there's a lot of choices if you think about all those questions I listed before and the different models you might use. Those all represent many different ways to skin the cat. And then I showed you one way that you could build a recipe to answer those questions. But that's not the only way to do it. You can do your own design work in a way that makes sense to you. And at the end of the day, it's your judgment that matters. So that's everything that I wanted to say about tonight. We've been going at it almost an hour, so I appreciate you guys hanging in there. Where does the time go? The recording should be available shortly. And I'm open to any final questions, or if you have questions occur to you later, by all means, just send them to me by email. I think I'm all caught up on the grading. There may be a few I haven't hit yet, but you guys are in great shape. Keep up the good work, and we will see you in the discussion boards. Take good care.